So, we're going to be talking today about personality and pain. And I think before we get going, we need to talk about what the term personality means in psychology, because it doesn't necessarily mean what you the it doesn't mean what you would use it, how you would use it in your everyday conversations. So when I use the term as a psychologist, I'm referring to the qualities of a person that are defining and don't change much over time. So these are the qualities of a person that you recognize as um, enduring features of who that person is. So it's not a reference to whether a person is charming or not, or whether they're outgoing or not, or whether they're fun to be around. Everybody has a personality. Everybody has this certain structure that underlies who they are. Okay, let's just review a little bit of neuroanatomy here. So, because it will become relevant in 3 seconds. So we have this long pipe here that electricity goes through. This is called an axon. It attaches to it extends from a cell body and then connects to other cell bodies through an electrical conduit. And sticking out of these cell bodies are these tree-like extensions that we call dendrites. So 3 basic parts to the neuron: the cell body, this purple part, this long pipe called an axon, which is insulated with something called myelin. It makes the nerve impulses travel faster. And then these dendritic extensions that connect to other cell bodies. All right, so here's why it's important. Our brains. When we come into the world, we come into the world with a lot of neural tissue, a lot of these connections that I just talked to you about. They're not very specialized yet in terms of higher functioning, but they're all there and ready to go. All right. And we call this synaptogenesis. It's just proliferating, lots and lots of tissue, lots of brain matter developing. Okay. But over time, something happens. So during our early childhood, these dendritic connections that you saw in that first slide, those little purple tree-like things, are going to get pruned away. And in other places, they're going to proliferate. So 2 things are going on. Those little tree-like connections are being pruned away, eliminated, or developed. And there are 2 things that determine when they're pruned away and when they're developed. The function is experience. So what you experience is going to cause the dendrites underneath those experiences to proliferate. This may not make much sense at this point, but it will. Just hang with me. And if you're deprived of an experience, then those dendrites are going to be pruned out. So if an experience is going on, the neural network that is a part of that experience will expand. And if an experience is not happening, the neural network that was possible is going to be eliminated or pruned away. So let me give you an example. Let's say genes, okay, somebody comes into the world with a ton of musical talent, just overflowing with musical talent. And the parent exposes the kid at a very young age to the piano. So here we have this little kid at 4-year-old little kid sitting at the piano. What's happening is the genetic potential for musical talent is combining with experience to cause the neural net that produces music to expand in the brain. But let's say that same kid, same genetic endowment for music, was put into a family where music wasn't valued that much. So the kid did not get that training. that neural net will not develop in the same way. And in fact, that potential will get pruned out. So very much the development of our brains is a function of genetic potential interacting with environment to literally sculpt the brain. And that process goes on through at least the first 14 years of life. And some people think longer, to as far as maybe 25 years of life. And that process of sculpting the brain is what leads to personality. And why is that important? It's important because after we hit 25 at the latest, it's not going to change a whole lot. It is literally sculpted into flesh. And that process of pruning and creating stops at a certain point. That's a little bit misleading. We'll come to that in a minute. But that massive change in higher order brain function, the structure underneath higher order brain function, thinking, talking, perceiving, all of that stops and leaves us with a structure that we call personality. So all personality, in the end, is neuroanatomic, created by a combination of genes and learning. It is not that pliable after a certain age. That's the importance of understanding this. All right, so I'm going to teach you about two theories of personality, and these are the reigning theories, the most popular theories, the ones with the most data behind them. And here's the thing. So yes, we are all individuals. We are. But there are certain aspects of personality that we all have some amount of. And researchers disagree a tiny bit on what those are, but there's mostly agreement between researchers, as you'll see as we go along here. This is the work of C. Robert Cloninger, and his work teaches us that there are 4 traits in personality structure that are present for everybody in some amount. So they are harm avoidance, novelty seeking, reward dependence, and persistence. And let's talk a little bit about what these mean. All of these things are generators of energy. They are what create our motives for behaving, okay? So let's look at harm avoidance. Some people are very, very low on harm avoidance. Some people are very, very high on harm avoidance, and some people in the middle, all right? And what does it mean, harm avoidance? It means the degree to which the individual is motivated, okay, there's that word, motivated to avoid harm. So if you're very low on harm avoidance, you're going to be kind of fearless. And if you're very, very low on harm avoidance, maybe fearless to the point of being kind of like not too smart. Like the people I see on Reels on Facebook, who do some things that just look like, frankly, idiotic. Very, very, very low, okay? As opposed to very, very, very high, the other end of the continuum, these people are going to be looking for potential harm everywhere and doing everything they can to avoid it. And you can see how both of these ends, the really, really low and the really, really high, could cause problems. And most people sit in the middle. Out here on the very tail ends, there aren't that many people, and that's a good thing. So novelty seeking, the degree to which a person is motivated for new experience. If you're low on novelty seeking, you prefer to have things in a traditional way. You do not seek out change in your own life. You like predictability. You like things the same. If you're high on novelty seeking, you're going to bore easily and you're going to seek out new experiences. If you're living in a highly structured, highly repetitive environment, you're not going to be happy. So, as you'll see as we go along here, it's important that you match your actual life to what your brain wants. Okay. So, this is kind of an important thing. Reward dependence. This is the degree to which a person is motivated for feedback. So if you're high on reward dependence, you're going to be the person who looks for that great job, or this might need to be adjusted this way, or you're going to be looking for feedback and you're going to be motivated for feedback. And if you don't get that feedback, you're not going to be happy. You're going to feel lost. You're going to feel unclear about what next you should do, kind of paralyzed. Whereas if you're low in reward dependence, you don't care. What motivates you is not that feedback. It's other things, but not that feedback. And so these people who are low in reward dependence are not actually even very responsive to feedback because it just doesn't ring their bell. It's just not part of the way their brain is put together. And then persistence, the last one in Cloninger's system. Persistence means the degree to which a person is motivated to complete a task. So people who are highly persistent, you can't pull them off a task. And sometimes, maybe they'll get stuck on something that really is impossible to achieve, but you can't pull them off of it. Low persistence, they can't stick with it. They give up easily. And then most people are in the middle. Most people are in the middle of all of these things. But think about it as a scale of 0 to or 1 to 10. Let's think of it that way. 1 being very little of a trait, and 10 being max on the trait. And you, as an individual, are somewhere 1 to 10 on each of these dimensions. And so I'm encouraging you to think about where you sit on these things, because it does impact how you interact with medical care and how you experience your pain. So here's something to understand. Temperament, what we're talking about right now, is heritable. You inherit the basic template from your parents, your biological parents. I tell people to think of this as a paint palette, a color palette, or a box of crayons, not to minimize the experience, but you come in with certain possibilities, a certain range of colors, a certain palette of paint. You don't get to pick outside of that. That is your potential. That's what you come in with. Now, let's say you come into the world with mostly pastels. Well, you can paint all kinds of pictures with pastels, but you can't paint pictures with bold colors because they're not on your palette. So let's break these down a little bit more. So, harm avoidance. If you're high on harm avoidance, you're going to tend to be pessimistic. You're going to tend to be fearful. You're going to tend to be shy. You're going to tend to fatigue easily. And remember, this is the number 1, 2s, and 3s. All right. If you're low on harm avoidance, you're going to tend to be optimistic, daring, outgoing, energetic. So these are the ends. And then as we get toward the middle, we start to see mixtures. All right. Novelty seeking, high. You're exploratory. You tend to be impulsive. You tend to be extravagant. And you probably tend to be irritable. So maybe you get your eye on a new car, a new red car. You're the person that's going to go out and buy that red car without really thinking through the financial repercussions of buying that red car. And that red car is probably going to be, red, extravagant. And if somebody gets in your way, well, honey, I don't know, we need to be saving money for a down payment on a house. You're going to be irritated by that because it gets in the way of that goal pursuit. Whereas if you're low, you're going to tend to be reserved, deliberate, thrifty, stoical, kind of hold on to your emotions, not really very expressive. And then these two kinds of people marry each other. That's an interesting thing that happens all the time. So, reward dependence. If you're high on reward dependence, you're going to tend to be sentimental, open, warm, appreciative, fuzzy, warm and fuzzy. If you're low, you're going to have the tendency to be detached, reserved, colder, more removed emotionally, and more independent. If you're high in persistence, you're going to tend to be industrious, determined, enthusiastic, perfectionistic. This can be problematic, obviously. Inert if you're low, spoiled, kind of an underachiever, pragmatic. So the low persistent person is hard to motivate to a task, whereas the high persistent person is self-motivating but difficult to disengage from a task when the task needs to be let go. All right. I don't know how much into the weeds we want to get into this, but each of these traits is attached to a particular neurochemical pathway in the brain. So harm avoidance, the GABA pathway, and serotonergic, novelty seeking, dopaminergic, reward dependence, noradrenergic. Now, what does any of this mean, really? This is what I think you should know out of this. This harm avoidant pathway is going to cause problems for people with pain, because once you have the experience of facial pain, which is frankly, it's very earth-shattering the first time it happens. The person with high harm avoidance is going to have the tendency to become very hypervigilant, very anxious, and alarmed, and in a way that does not go away. So they're going to be searching out for the next pain experience. And that all happens through serotonin in the brain. Now, you may be thinking, I've heard something about serotonin. You probably have, because it's attached to the experience of depression and anxiety. And so that system of the brain can deregulate in susceptible people so that they develop anxiety and depression. So those high harm avoidant people lean against the tendency to become depressed and anxious. And I think we'll just go to the next slide. Now, this is a different model of personality. This is the most famous of the two. You'll notice that it's very similar. So this is called the Big Five model, which you may have heard about. It does turn up online and in social media sometimes. Factor 1 is extroversion. Factor 2, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability versus neuroticism. We'll talk more about this, and openness to experience. So let's take a look at each of these. I'm looking at the time. This one is, as I said, more famous. There are tests for this. I can do this test for people and tell them where they sit on all these dimensions, which is kind of neat. All right, let's look at them. Neuroticism. These are people, if they're high on neuroticism, and again, think about this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 scale. Okay? Neuroticism, people who are prone to psychological distress. They are worriers. They tend to be anxious. Now, in this model, okay, you may be high on some of these 6 subdomains and not others. So if you're a high neurotic, that doesn't mean that you're high on all of these other things, but you may be. You're certainly high on some of them, or you wouldn't be high on that dimension at all. So anxiety, free floating. When we say anxiety is free floating, what I mean is it's not attached to any one thing. It just floats out there, and anything. It can sort of glom itself onto anything. You can worry about anything, okay? And are likely to worry about anything. Angry hostility, the tendency to experience anger, frustration, bitterness, what we call negative affect. Depression, the tendency to feel sad, guilty, lonely, self-conscious, feeling shy, socially anxious, impulsive, the tendency to act on urges rather than think about them before acting, and vulnerability, being easily hurt. All right. And now, obviously, here's the thing. If you are high on neuroticism, in one sense, in a sense that matters a lot, you can't help it because this is a genetic outcome. And let's say that you have the genetics for high neuroticism and you were exposed to childhood abuse or neglect. So you have genes driving the development of those synapses and dendrites in a neurotic direction, and you have experience teaching you that the world is a dangerous place. And so what gets cut into the brain, what gets sculpted into the brain, is this highly neurotic orientation to the world. And it's important to understand that this is not a moral failing. It is biology. Now, it can be modified some, and thankfully it can be, because that's what keeps people like me in a job. But it will remain underneath to some degree. And that's true for all of these factors, not just neuroticism. Extroversion, the energy directed outward into the social world. So high extroverted people are warm, they're gregarious, they prefer company of others, they're not introverts. They're assertive, so they express themselves in social contexts. These are not the people who are hanging on the back. These are the people who become active in the social experience because of their level of interest. It's not necessarily because they're seeking attention. It's because they are caught up in the experience. They are alive in the experience. These are active people. These are not prodders. These people have an engine underneath them. Okay? So they're not low energy people. And they have a high need for stimulation. These people bore easily. And they have a tendency to experience positive emotions. So they're more optimistic in their bent than someone who has this neurotic high neurosis. Openness to experience. So these are people who have a very active life of mind. They are imaginative. They are very often interested in the arts. They're people who are interested in what they are feeling and what other people are feeling. So they're searching. They're looking for meaning. They tend to be intellectually curious. Now, keeping in mind, I'm talking about the high end on all of these. And the low end is obviously the opposite. And then, as I said, by definition, most of us are in the middle on all of these. Agreeableness. So these trust easily. They tend to be open in their emotional expression. They tend to have a high concern for others. They do not do well with interpersonal conflict. These are people who will retreat from it. They will not talk about it. They can't handle it very well. These are people who tend to play down their achievements because they don't enjoy competition. They are looking for a conflict-free sphere in which to interact. They tend to be tender-minded. They tend to be sympathize with others, reflexively. Conscientious. These are people who are highly competent. They're driven for, this has a lot to do, it's very similar to the persistence dimension in Cloninger's system. They're dutiful, they're achievement stripe. You're not going to find a surgeon who is low on conscientiousness, just not. All right, so what does this have to do with pain? This is where it really becomes important. Persons with high neuroticism scores tend to report more symptoms of pain and bodily distress. So here's what happens, and this is so important. Let's say you're a high neurotic. That sounds so damning, but I wish it didn't, because there are really good people who are high on this dimension. There are people who really try hard, who do lots of good for lots of people in the world. But they struggle with this. And once they have an experience of chronic pain, or once they have an experience of pain, one experience, especially something as intense as facial pain, there's a tendency for it to become chronic. So these people, once they have this very impactful, salient experience of facial pain, are going to be looking for the next episode. Everybody looks for the next episode because it's no fun. But people who are high on neuroticism look very intently, and they begin to notice every little thing that they feel. Every little twitch, every little tightness, and just think about how this could go. So let's say your jaw is tight because you've been concentrating or stressed about something, and it's created a low-grade muscle tension here that is associated with some pain. The person who's high in neuroticism is going to find that. And they're going to look at it internally as a potential predictor of future episodes of facial pain, trigeminal neuralgic episodes of facial pain. So it's going to take on meaning for them that it does not take on for people who are lower in neuroticism. So this high neurotic person is experiencing pain that gets layered on. So they have the facial pain. I don't know if you can see my hands, but they have the facial pain experience. But then it's like static electricity around a styrofoam ball. Their neuroticism causes all the other little discomforts that they have to take on great significance and sticks like little tiny balls to the big ball. And their experience of pain becomes more complex and more persistent. And they tend to catastrophize around that, to imagine the worst possible outcome. And this leaves people open for certain negative results. These people can become addicted to opiates because they're so frightened of pain that they are looking for something to ease them. And these medicines, if they're available, are inherently addicting. These are people who will seek out surgeries, who will always take the option for surgery when it's offered because they are terrified of more pain. So high neuroticism correlates with pain catastrophizing. This is horrible what's happening to me. It will always be horrible, and more horrible stuff is coming. I just know it. That's the high neurotic experience. People who, by the grace of God, I don't mean that necessarily literally, but I mean they're born into the world with high extroversion and openness to experience and agreeableness, don't tend to pain catastrophize. So they're not living with that horrible fear. Now, just imagine that these people marry each other. So let's say we have a patient with trigeminal neuralgia who's a high neurotic, married to someone who has these other qualities of higher extroversion, openness to experience, and agreeableness. This spouse is going to have the tendency, not consciously, but of their own natural bent, to minimize the high neurotic's fear. Now, what that will do to the high neurotic is that makes them feel unloved, and it also makes them more frightened, because if you're not watching for it, it could come and get you from behind. So this creates conflict in relationships. There is a theory called the multidimensional pain inventory. It's a test, actually, attached to a theory, that there are 3 kinds of pain patients: dysfunctional pain patients, interpersonally distressed pain patients, and adaptive copers. Now, this system is probably overly simplified, but here it is. So the dysfunctional group are people who have high levels of pain and pain interference. Pain gets in the way in their daily lives with a lot of emotional distress. And you can see that these people probably are high on that neurotic index, all right? The interpersonally distressed people are people who are persistently feeling that others don't really understand how uncomfortable they are. So these are people who go through the experience or go through life feeling misunderstood. And then there are the adaptive copers. And these are people who do well with pain. Now, I offer this slide to you almost with guilt because it is way oversimplified. For example, let's just move on. I want you to know it's there because it completes the whole discussion, but I also want you to feel comfortable disregarding it. But let's look at some research that applies this NEO 5-factor model to this Turk and Rudy model. People who are interpersonally distressed, these are the people who feel persistently misunderstood, who feel that others don't get their pain, tend to be high on neuroticism and moderate on the openness to experience dimension. People who are dysfunctional, so they don't do well with pain, they tend to fear it, they tend to focus on it, but they don't blame others in their experience for misunderstanding them. They don't feel misunderstood, but they don't cope well with pain, as if anybody did, but you understand what I'm saying. They are less neurotic than the interpersonally distressed group, moderate on that dimension, so in the middle. And they are low on an openness to experience. And this is probably significant because it keeps them socially withdrawn, because that openness to experience kicks people into social activity. It kicks people into a social connection. And so these people are low in that dimension, which by definition means that they're going to have less support. Okay? Adaptive copers are low in neuroticism. Yay. Understand they didn't earn it. They didn't earn it. They were born this way. They are the highest of the 3 groups in terms of extroversion. They are high in openness to experience. So they're interested in stuff. They're probably doing their own research. They're probably seeking out information. And they're the highest of the 3 in terms of agreeableness. So these are people who want to get along, and they are going to run from anything that is not that involves conflict. I would argue to their own expense, but. So these adaptive copers, God bless them, they don't have a great vulnerability to anxiety and depression. They are characterized by greater emotional stability. They're open to a wider variety of experiences, and they have a greater resistance to dropping out of treatment. These people may be open to stuff that's not considered traditional. So these people may be more open to hypnosis, meditation, acupuncture, whereas other groups may be more resistant to those things. And I would argue that if a person is resistant to those things as a function of their personality, they may not be helpful to them anyway. We need to uh, we need to craft therapy to fit the person and not expect the person to fit the therapy, if you understand what I mean. And this is why every therapist does not work for every patient, because we all tend to have a bag of tricks that we use a lot, all the time, and a patient who doesn't match that bag of tricks, probably not going to get on great with them, and they probably need someone else. So I'm going to let you read this slide, but I'm going to say, do not take this to heart in a way that is self-damaging or self-hurtful. Surgeries for facial pain are rarely done promiscuously, meaning without necessity. By the time a person gets to the place where they're needing a microvascular decompression surgery, they need a microvascular decompression surgery. That's not something that's going to be likely offered to them without much thought or accepted without much thought. But you can read the slide. Or here's some references if you have questions. And it's a little bit early, perhaps, but I wonder, could we go to Q&A at this point?
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Leesa Scott-Morrow. We do have some questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first question is, you talked a little bit about acupuncture and meditation. So, and that was for certain people. Can mindfulness help with high neuroticism?
Okay, I'm glad the question comes up. So let's say an individual is a high neurotic. Is that done? I mean, is it written in stone? Is it ever going to change? It can change. And the way it changes is through mindfulness. So the first thing is you become aware, okay, this is who I am. I didn't pick it, but it's who I am. I have other things that are really wonderful about me, but this thing causes problems. And so becoming aware of it, we call that becoming mindful. And then what comes next from that is you begin to have a second layer of questioning. So you notice that you have the pain in your jaw. Oh my God. So the very natural fear is, oh my God, now I'm going to start having those trigeminal neuralgia attacks again. And I understand that fear is so real for these people. It is not histrionics. It is, I almost dropped the F-bomb. Whoops. It is deeply real. But if you layer on that second layer of mindfulness that goes, okay, wait. I know that I am more aware of relatively little physical signals than other people because of this quality in me. Therefore, yes, I can feel this, but it probably doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to start having these facial zapping attacks again. So that mindfulness is associated with the capacity to question yourself. And once you can question yourself, you can modify this stuff a little bit. You develop what we call the therapist introject, which is the therapist that lives in your head, the little therapist that lives in your head and begins to put in that capacity to question and be mindful.
Wonderful. Thank you. Another question is, can your temperament traits change over time?
Not much.
No.
Not much by themselves. I mean, with work, yes, they can change. And it's also true that there tends to be a softening of these extreme traits as we age. So, the guy who goes and climbs Mount Everest at 23 and again at 30 and at 40 may start to question whether he or she should climb Everest at 50. So there may be some softening, but for the most part, the tendencies are there forever. They're good in place forever.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question is, this is kind of, I'm not sure if you can answer this. Someone asked about your being short-tempered. Is that more likely because of the pain, or is that a side effect of medication?
Okay, I can answer that. I can try to answer that anyway. So let's just look at the symptom. So we're looking now at a very specific symptom called irritability. All right. It can have many different causes, and you can have more than one cause at a time. We know that pain increases irritability. Okay. Just pain. We know that depression increases irritability. Just depression. We know that anxiety increases irritability, just anxiety. So all these things, these three things can increase irritability, all right? Now, they rarely come alone. So chronic pain is often associated with depression. Acute pain, meaning it's happening right now, the bad thing is happening right now, is associated with anxiety. So now we have these two things that cause irritability interacting together. So medication side effects. Let me address that. Some medications are associated with an irritability side effect, and the one that comes immediately to mind is Ambien. Ambien helps people sleep, but on the daytime experience, they may have increased irritability. And this is because they're going through a little bit of withdrawal during the day. And that withdrawal is what's causing the irritability. Same thing from the benzodiazepines like Xanax or Valium. Well, not Valium so much because Valium's a long-acting drug, but withdrawal is associated with irritability.
Thank you. How can an adaptive coper support someone who is falling under the high neurotic?
Ooh, great question. Great question. First thing, understand they didn't choose it. And understand that the fear that they have is so real. And it is a pervasive, consuming experience. So start with empathy and understand that it will not make them okay to chide them or express disappointment or indicate in any way that they failed. It also will not help them to threaten them with the negative outcomes that could come about. It's helpful when you say, I understand how scary this is. I get it. I get that you're understanding. I get that you're feeling this and I believe it and I see it. And then maybe help them with mindfulness, help them with some data around what's likely to happen. But it's a tough call. And I would say if that becomes a persistent quality in a relationship, it's time to reach out for some help.
Wonderful, thank you. You did touch on this a little bit, but can a traumatic experience dramatically alter temperament?
Oh boy, that is a great question. So there's this thing in PTSD called complex PTSD. And what complex PTSD is, it's a combination of this stuff and childhood trauma. So we're looking now at childhood trauma. And definitely childhood trauma can pump up that neuroticism stuff. It absolutely can make an appreciable impact there. Now, trauma that occurs later in life after the brain is developed doesn't have as powerful effect, but it can surely result in increased anxiety and increased reactivity. Absolutely. Yes.
Another question, and this is perfectionism associated with neuroticism, and how can you recover from that?
Oh my God. These questions are so exciting to me because they're
We have
so
an awesome
good.
audience.
That's so good. So here's the thing that I did not say before because, we don't have a ton of time. But keep in mind that you don't just have one of these traits. You've got all of them to some degree. I tell people if they had color, if these traits had color, and you screwed off the top of somebody's head and you looked into their brain, you would see some amount of each color. So it is entirely possible to be high on neuroticism and high on everything else. Now that's a mind-blowing kind of thing, but what was the question again, so I can address it specifically?
Perfectionism.
So let's look at the perfectionism piece. Perfectionism is a function of that persistent stuff, that task-oriented stuff. Now let's say you're also highly neurotic. You've got them both, high on both. You can see that that's going to be a very particular kind of experience as opposed to someone who is maybe high on persistence but low on neuroticism. That person is not going to suffer as much because they can't get the task to complete as the person who's high on neuroticism. The person who's high on neuroticism is going to layer on all this other stuff. I'm going to fail. Oh my God, I'm going to get fired. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So they're going to layer on all that other stuff in addition to that persistence.
Thank you. You did also mention that not every therapist is for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give people some tips on finding a therapist who can specialize in treating someone with chronic pain? Or is there a website that we can direct our attendees to?
There's no website that I'm aware of. I would say it's best to see somebody who specializes in chronic pain, but those people are not always available. If you are having trouble finding them, go to the nearest university and ask in the psychology department who specializes in chronic pain. But beyond that, I mean, I think there are therapists that don't have any training in chronic pain that turn out to be great therapists. What the research literature teaches us is that the more alike, in terms of these personality structures, the more alike the therapist and the client are, the better the therapy outcome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can deep faith or religion change your traits?
Oh boy, that's an interesting thing. The research teaches us no. The research teaches us that it can't, but there is definitely a role for faith. I'm not diminishing the importance of faith, but I think that role is probably more one of acceptance. It's probably more one of, God does not make mistakes kind of a thing. And if this is the way you are turned, or someone that you love is turned or built, then I think the thing that faith does for us is lead to acceptance, compassion, love, rather than changing.
Thank you. Someone asked they would have a better temperament if they weren't getting constant pain in their face. So I know as a patient myself, I can 100% relate to that. Do you have any tips, tricks, anything? What would you?
Yeah. So I would say that, especially on that neuroticism index, that index is really the degree to which a person is reactive to their environment. So people who are highly neurotic are very reactive, and people who are low neurotics are slow to react. So let's say you've got this pain happening in your face, whatever you are on that neuroticism index, it's going to pump it up a little. So if you're low, it'll probably bump you up into moderate. If you're moderate, it'll probably bump you up into high while you're having that experience, because it's going to increase your reactivity. The other thing to keep in mind is this personality stuff is a separate thing from depression and anxiety. So the personality stuff is like background. It's like who we are. But then stuff happens. People develop depression or they develop anxiety. Those are disorders. They are not part of this background. And So I would also be attentive to the possibility of developing depression or anxiety in anybody with chronic facial pain.
Thank you. This question has to do with neurologists. Do neurologists assume that TN patients are a certain personality type?
Oh,
and I'll throw it out there, neurologists and neurosurgeons.
yeah. You know what I'm going to do right now? I'm going to be honest. Okay? So first of all, they don't know about this research. This is not in their bailiwick. I don't know how to do a microvascular decompression surgery. They don't know about this stuff. What happens is when a patient comes in, God forbid, this could honk some people off, but when a patient comes in and they don't get better, the neurologist does everything they can, the neurosurgeon does everything they can, and the patient comes in and they don't get better, there is a tendency, okay, not always, but a tendency for physicians to blame the patient. This even has a name in social psychology. We call this fundamental attribution error. And it is the tendency to blame the suffering person for the cause of their suffering. And oftentimes, the cause of suffering, not just with pain, but with many things in life, are external to the person. So, for example, people lose jobs, not because they've done bad work, but because of 100 other reasons. But people have the tendency to attribute to them responsibility for having lost their job. And physicians do that with their patients. They have a tendency to see the patient as somebody who's not trying enough or who's inclined to whine or when they don't get better. And that can be really stressful for people. And I would say, again, this is the time to go get a therapist. Talk about it. There may be ways you can change your communication. Shouldn't have to, but there might be ways that you can change your communication that would make that problem go away.
Wonderful. Another question having to do with meditation. How can that affect our pain? You did touch on meditation, but a little bit, but how can that affect our pain?
Okay, let's say, so remember I said that harm avoidant dimension, which is the one I keep talking about because it's the one that impacts things the most, is a serotonin system, right? And so the antidepressants, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, regulate that system when it gets out of whack. And when that regulation occurs, the catastrophic thinking diminishes, the fear diminishes, all the other apprehension diminishes. And keep in mind that whenever we're afraid, there are chemical changes that go on in the body. We excrete a whole bunch of fight or flight chemicals, and those things increase the perception of pain. Now we're really down the rabbit hole with Alice, but understand there are two things that happen. There's the actual neural stimulus that's associated for pain, and then there is the part of your brain that perceives that neural stimulus, and they are not the same thing. So the perception part can magnify the effect of that, or to some extent diminish the effect of that. And obviously what we worry about is the magnification of that. And that's a serotonergic problem. So if it happens a lot, we might be able to reduce that perception piece, and the outcome on balance is less pain. Does that make sense? It's kind of a complicated thing, but that's the way it works.
That balancing.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Why would doctors say, or why do doctors say we have general anxiety disorder when we ask or we complain about the pain that isn't being treated enough and we ask for more help? Why are doctors so quick to give that diagnosis.
I think sometimes people do have generalized anxiety disorder. Let's just acknowledge that. And sometimes people with generalized anxiety disorder develop pain, and that's a really difficult thing when it happens. But true generalized anxiety disorder involves, by definition, okay, by the book, it involves worrying about lots of things. So people with generalized anxiety disorder worry about everything. They know they worry about everything. They know it's probably overkill, but they can't stop it. That's true generalized anxiety disorder. Worrying just about the pain is a different thing. So if this is not a pervasive trait or tendency, it's probably not generalized anxiety disorder. It's probably something else.
Okay, all right. Before we end, would you be able to just put up your reference slide real fast? A lot of people asking for that.
There it is. Do you see it?
I'm not sure if that was the one that they were talking about. Did you have one earlier? I thought there was one.
See, that's the only reference slide I have.
Maybe it wasn't the reference slide. You had a first, it was earlier in your presentation. You said you just wanted to share this with people, but you weren't going to go into it too deeply. Yes, I believe that's what they're looking for.
What I don't like about this, and I know we're out of time really, but what I don't like about this is it doesn't take into account the social setting in which pain occurs. It doesn't address people who are experiencing pain in the context of a relationship, and that relationship may have an impact of one kind or another. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I believe that's the word. All right, Dr. Morrow, thank you so much. This was an awesome presentation. And to all our attendees, just before we go on a break, we have a quick change in our agenda. Dr. Linsky needed to go into an emergency surgery and his session was supposed to be at 12:30. So in lieu of that, we are going to have a Q&A session with a few doctors from our medical advisory board. So when you join that session, you can just type in your questions. You can also attend Dr. Klasser's session occurring at the same time at 12:30 on dental care. So thank you so much, Dr. Scott-Morrow.
Can I add just one thing?
Sure.
Just quick. Be careful not to use the stuff you've learned today to go diagnose all your family. And if you would like to further discuss these ideas or you have questions for me, there should be contact information through the Facial Pain Association. And with that, I say adieu, auf Wiedersehen. Bye-bye.